Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to a very exciting video. I am very excited. Today I'm going to be doing my Victorian October announcement and TBR. So I've mentioned a few times in the previous months that I was planning on doing something called Victorian October. The basic premise of Victorian October is to read more Victorian literature in the month of October. So Victorian October is going ahead, and it is being hosted by me, by Yamini from The Skeptical Reader, by Agne from Beyond the Pages, by Alysia from Ex Libris, and also by Kate Howell. We are all very excited to be embarking upon a Victorian October. So today I thought I would tell you a little bit more about our plans for Victorian October, a few things about some challenges we have for everyone else who might want to join in, and also talk you through my TBR for the month. So the basic premise of Victorian October is to read more Victorian books, more Victorian literature during the month of October than you usually would. I'm going to be reading entirely Victorian literature for the month of October and no non-Victorian books. When we say Victorian literature, we mean any book, whether fiction or non-fiction or poetry or plays, published or written in Britain between 1837 and 1901. So if you want to read something by, say, Geraldine Hopkins, who wrote a lot of poetry throughout the Victorian period, but none of which was published until the 1910s, that's fine. It's still Victorian, even though it wasn't published until after the Victorian period because it was written during the Victorian period. Likewise, how you define something as British literature is open to interpretation. Anything written and published in Ireland in the Victorian period counts as Victorian. Anything written by someone British in the British Empire or living abroad counts as British, and anything written by someone who was not British born but was living in Britain also counts as British. For example, I would count Joseph Conrad because he was a British citizen for a lot of the time when he was writing his books, even though he was not born in Britain. I normally don't count Henry James as Victorian because I always view him as American, but if you want to count Henry James as Victorian, you can, because although he was American, he did live in Britain for quite a while during the 19th century. But basically, Victorian literature is British literature from between 1837 and 1901. So the five of us who are hosting Victorian October have come up with 5 challenges to set everybody and each other. And the idea is that each of us is kind of sponsoring one challenge each. So in our TBR videos, which should all be going up today or around this kind of time, we will all give you some recommendations for the challenge that is ours. So Yamini's challenge is to read a gothic Victorian novel. Angie's challenge is to read a book by a Victorian female author. Kate Howell's challenge is to read a Victorian book within the course of 1 week. Alicia's challenge is to read a book where a plot is afoot or some kind of scheme is occurring. And my challenge is to read a piece of Victorian literature that is not a novel. Also, during the month of October, I am planning that every video I upload will be related to the Victorians. We're certainly going to be doing a tag video together for Victorian October, and I'd quite like to do a video about where to start with Victorian literature, and also a video about my favourite Victorian books and my favourite TV or film adaptations of Victorian books. I also have a short story that I'm excited to share with you that is set in the Victorian period. That will probably be in 2 parts. This is a slightly longer short story, but I'm looking forward to reading that aloud and sharing that with you in the month of October as well. So before I talk through my TBR, I'm going to quickly talk through my challenge. So the aim of this challenge is basically to get people reading more Victorian literature that are not novels, because I feel like Victorian novels are quite widely read, but Victorian poetry is, to my mind, quite neglected, as is Victorian drama, as is Victorian non-fiction. I love Victorian literature, but the bulk of Victorian literature I know is novels, and I've read some Victorian drama and some Victorian poetry, but not nearly as much as I have read of the Victorian novels, and I have quite a lot of Victorian non-fiction that I am interested in reading. So that is why I have come up with this challenge, and I have a few recommendations for you. So if you feel like reading some Victorian drama within the month of October, the 2 main dramatists I would recommend are Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw. Now, I haven't read a lot of George Bernard Shaw myself, and I'm planning on reading some George Bernard Shaw during the month of October. If you are going to read some George Bernard Shaw, do watch out, because half of his plays are Victorian and half of his plays are beyond the Victorian period and written just after, in the 1900s and 1910s. However, quite a lot of his famous plays that I hear very, very good things about were written during the Victorian period. So we have Widowers' Houses, Mrs. Warren's Profession, which is what I want to read during the month of October, and then Arms and the Man and Candida are supposed to be very good as well. Oscar Wilde is my favourite dramatist from the Victorian period, and one of my favourite dramatists ever. I love his plays. They are hilarious, witty, but often really profound and clever as well, and he critiques the upper classes in Victorian society in a glorious, glorious way. I would highly recommend The Importance of Being Earnest, which is quite fun and a good place to start with his plays, but I would also sincerely recommend Lady Windermere's Fan, and above all, A Woman of No Importance. A Woman of No Importance just makes you want to hug Oscar Wilde, because it is just Victorian feminism, and it's just like beautiful. Or maybe you want to read some Victorian poetry during the month of October. I will link down below my Victorian poets introduction videos from my series How to Speak Victorian, but I do have a few particular Victorian poets I would like to recommend as really good places to start. I would especially recommend the poetry of Christina Rossetti. She is my favourite Victorian poet and one of my favourite poets of all time. She writes beautiful poetry which is just full of imagination and strangeness, often magic and sort of fairy tale themes, especially in her longer poem Goblin Market. And then she also writes quite interestingly about religion and life and loss, and it's just beautiful. It's great. She uses language in a wonderful way, and the rhythms in which she uses to write are just fantastic. I know there is a Penguin Little Black Classic of Goblin Market, which is probably quite a good place to start with her work. And on the subject of Little Black Classics, I would like to recommend this. This is Nonsense by Edward Lear. In fact, I would like to recommend anything by Edward Lear. His poetry is very nonsensical and silly, but it is such great fun. He wrote The Owl and the Pussycat, if you know that poem, and I would really recommend any of Edward Lear if you want to read some Victorian poetry, because it's just very silly and very lovely. Someone else I would like to mention is Gerald Manley Hopkins. He writes in a really interesting rhythm, and I find his poetry really accessible because it's less about what the poetry is about and more about the way he uses language, which I find I can just really enjoy reading it because it sounds nice. Some other poets I would recommend would be Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Robert Browning, both of whose poetry I quite enjoy. And also, if you are a fan of the Brontes, then all three Bronte sisters wrote poetry. If you are interested in the Brontes and like their books, it's certainly interesting to pick up their poetry. Or maybe you want to read some Victorian non-fiction during the month of October. I personally find reading non-fiction or essays from the Victorian period absolutely fascinating because it tells you so much about the period. I do have a few shorter essay recommendations which would not take you very long. One essay I would really recommend from the Victorian period is called Cassandra, and this was written by Florence Nightingale. And Cassandra is an essay that basically talks about how awful it is to be a woman in the 19th century, and especially how utterly boring and constraining it is to be a middle-class woman in the Victorian period. And it's just one of the most horrible but brilliant things I've ever read, and if you're interested in gender throughout history, then it's just fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. Another essay from the Victorian period I find really interesting is The Soul of Man Under Socialism by Oscar Wilde. This is Oscar Wilde's kind of, not exactly a political manifesto because it's Oscar Wilde, but it's him talking about how a particular system of socialism might affect the soul and artisticness, and how a particular way of living might enrich people. It is a very different look at socialism and is very idealised in many ways, but also really interesting. A less nice but equally interesting essay to read from the Victorian period is Of Queen's Gardens by John Ruskin. This will probably make a lot of people angry. It makes me very angry, but it's also absolutely fascinating, and it's basically John Ruskin talking about the position of women and men in Victorian society, and John Ruskin is of that particular school of Victorian thought of which Dickens was too, where he didn't think that women were below men, but he thought that women were completely different to men and occupied different spheres, and that they were much more moral. And it's not a very nice speech, but it's absolutely fascinating and tells you a lot about the way that gender was thought of during the Victorian period. Or if you want to read some full non-fiction books from the Victorian period, one of the things that I'm going to be reading in the month of October is The Uncommercial Traveller by Charles Dickens, which is a collection of kind of essays and musings and articles of Dickens. I don't know that much about it, but I'm very excited to read more of Dickens's non-fiction. In fact, another piece of Dickens non-fiction that I would recommend if you like is this, which is one of the Penguin Great Ideas series. This is Night Walks by Charles Dickens, and is just a sample of his essays and writings about society and life and things that he is seeing around him. And if you do enjoy the Penguin Great Ideas series, there is also some John Ruskin and some George Eliot and some Charles Darwin in that series. Likewise, there are a couple of Penguin Little Black Classics which deal with Victorian non-fiction. I'm going to be reading It Was Snowing Butterflies, which is some Charles Darwin writing, and I believe there's also one by John Ruskin too. So I hope that very long list gives you an idea about the kind of non-novel things that you might like to read in Victorian October. So, moving on from the challenges to the TBR. Sadly, I do not have a glorious, beautiful pile of books to show you, or indeed many books to show you at all. I'm currently in the process of moving, and my new flat doesn't have very much space, so I'm probably going to be doing most of my reading for Victorian October on Kindle, and those books that I do own have already been packed, and lots of things have already been packed, hence why I had a different teapot in my intro today. So I do not have many books to show you, but I do have many books to talk to you about, so yes, hurrah for Victorian literature. So, on to my TBR. I have a very long and very ambitious TBR. There are 15 books on my TBR. I don't really believe that I'm going to be able to read 15 Victorian books during the month of October. We will see. I will try. I have ambitions. So for Yamini's challenge, which is to read a piece of Gothic Victorian literature, I'm going to be reading Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I don't think that's how I say his name. Carmilla is a novella of about 100 pages, which is about vampires, and that is the extent of what I know about it. I believe it inspired Dracula. I'm not a huge fan of Dracula, but hey. For Anna's challenge, which is to read something by a female Victorian author. I have quite a few. One thing I'm going to be reading by a female writer is The Half Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury. I heard about this ages ago on Jen Campbell's channel, and she said that it was a book that if you liked North and South you would enjoy, and North and South is in my top 10 books of all time and I adore it, so I'm really excited to read The Half Sisters. I'm also going to be reading Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. I love Elizabeth Gaskell, she is one of my favourite authors, and every time I read something else by her I'm just astounded by how different it is from everything else that she's written and by how brilliant it is, so I'm really looking forward to reading Ruth. I'm also going to be reading Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I've been meaning to read this for a very long time and it comes very highly recommended to me from very many angles, but I'm going to be buddy reading this with Caroline from BBC Girl and I am really looking forward to this. It should be really exciting. I know it is a sensationalist novel and that she has some secret which makes Lady Audley unrespectable within Victorian society, but that is the extent of my knowledge. Now, Alicia's challenge is to read a book where a plot or a scheme is afoot, so I'm going to be reading for this The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. In fact, all 5 of us who are hosting Victorian October are all going to be reading The Moonstone within the month. I've actually read The Moonstone before, so this will be a reread for me, but I haven't read it since I was about 15, so I'm really looking forward to rereading it. It is a mystery novel. It has a lot of different characters narrating different bits of the book, which I remember I really liked. It's been such a long time since I read it that I'm really excited to reread it and kind of remember what it's about, because I have slightly forgotten. I remember I really enjoyed it. It's very pacey and very exciting and very, very easy to get into. Now, Kate's challenge, as I said before, is to read a Victorian novel within the course of a week. Now, as I am planning to read 15 books within the course of October, hopefully I will have to read more than 1 book a week. However, for this particular challenge, the book I'm assigning to it is The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, which Kate and I are actually going to be buddy reading together. I hear such good things about The Woodlanders, and Yamini, Agne and Alysia, who I have been reading lots of other Hardy novels with, have all read it and all think it's brilliant, so I'm very, very excited for this one. And then for my challenge, to read some Victorian literature that isn't novels, I do have quite a few things planned. As I already said, I want to read The Uncommercial Traveller by Charles Dickens, which I am very, very excited about because I need to read more of his non-fiction. I've read all his novels and I love them so much, but I have been greatly neglecting his non-fiction. I'm also going to be reading It Was Snowing Butterflies by Charles Darwin, which is one of the Penguin Little Black Classics. This is a selection of Charles Darwin's journals, I believe, from his time when he was on the ship the Beagle. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be reading Mrs. Warren's Profession by George Bernard Shaw, which is a play. Now, I'm very intrigued and excited to read this, because I hear very, very good things about Mrs. Warren's Profession, and especially the ways in which it talks about gender within Victorian society, so I'm excited for that. And still sticking away from the novels, I want to read The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell. I don't know if I will get the time to read this because I know that this is nearly 600 pages and for non-fiction that might be quite tricky to read, but I love Elizabeth Gaskell's writing and I'm fascinated in the Brontes, and I think it would be really interesting to see one Victorian writer's reflection on the life of another Victorian writer, especially because Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte did know each other and were friends. Still away from the novels, I would also like to read some Victorian poetry, and that is going to be this month Modern Love by George Meredith. I read The Egoist, which is a novel by George Meredith, at the beginning of the year and thought it was incredible and did some of the most interesting things with roles of gender within Victorian society that I've seen in a Victorian novel. So George Meredith is like high up there in my estimation right now, so I'm excited to read more by him. But I know he wrote a series of sonnets which is called Modern Love and is basically about the breakup of a marriage, I believe, so I'm quite excited to get to that. And then I'm also going to be reading another Hardy during the month of October, and this I'm going to be buddy reading with Anne from Beyond the Pages and Alysia from Ex Libris. I think Yamini is not joining in for this one, but we're going to be reading The Wessex Tales by Thomas Hardy, which is a collection of his short stories. Now, I have read very few Victorian short story collections actually, despite the fact that I love short stories and I love Victorian literature. These things just haven't coincided yet, but I do love Hardy and I'm really interested to see how Hardy works in short story form because I've never read any other short stories by him. I will then also be reading Framley Parsonage by Anthony Trollope. I think I'll probably also be buddy reading this with Caroline from BBC Girl. This is the 4th book in Anthony Trollope's Barchester Chronicles. I've read The Warden and I've read Barchester Towers, and I will be reading, at the moment when this video goes up, Dr. Thorne, which is the 3rd book, and I'm really looking forward to Framley Parsonage. I'm just loving the series so far. I'm also hoping to read The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. I have enjoyed what I've read of H.G. Wells so far, but I have found that I liked his novel Kits, which is a realist novel, much more than I've liked his science fiction, so I'm interested to read The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I believe is science fiction or in some way fantastical. And finally, the 15th book I would like to read in the month of October is New Grub Street by George Gissing. I adore George Gissing, but I've only read one of his books. I read The Netherworld back when I was in my 3rd year of university, so more than 2 years ago now, and it just blew me away completely because it is so incredible and just like Hardy but urban and like even more depressing. It's just brilliant though, like so incredible, and I can't believe I haven't read anything else by him since. So in the month of October I really want to try and get to New Grub Street, because I think he is such a brilliant writer and really underrated. And yes, New Grub Street, I'm very excited. I don't know much about it, but I think the main character is a struggling writer, so I hear. That sounds like my kind of thing. Anyway, so there we have it. I think this has been a longer video than I intended, but basically, to cut a long story short, we will be reading Victorian literature in the month of October. Please join us, please come and read Victorian literature with us, because we, us five, are very excited, and Victorian literature is a great glorious thing. Please come and join in all the fun. So I think that is it. I am very excited to be reading a lot of Victorian literature in October. I'm hoping that I might be able to get to all 15 books, but I feel it is probably quite unlikely. However, I have hope, and we will see. Please let me know down in the comments if you are also planning on joining in with Victorian October and what you are going to be reading. Please, if you are joining in, do tell us about it and post about it on Twitter. We have a hashtag. The hashtag is Victober. I am very excited to be sharing lots of Victorian literature with a lot of glorious people. I think that is all for today. I'll be back very soon with another video, probably not on Thursday. As I said, I'm in the process of moving, so everything is a bit manic and I have no Wi-Fi, and this will be like pre-uploaded like 2 weeks before it goes up. But anyway, I'll be back probably on Monday with another video if we have Wi-Fi by then. Happy reading, and you know, happy Victorian October.